look, I think the two biggest challenges of our time are the epistemic chaos, which is what you're talking about, and the totally screwed up incentives of our political structure. Both of these things are sort of systemic, right? And if we can't create better incentives for our politicians and our people in leadership, and if we can't figure out some rules that govern public conversation, not ultimate belief. We don't have to have rules for what you can believe about ultimate reality or faith or spirituality. That's one of the beauties of our country, is that you can believe whatever you want there. Mm-hmm. But if we don't have rules for what we can discuss as legitimate and not legitimate in public conversations about the common good in politics and government, if we don't fix those two things, then we're going to have gradual decline and potentially, catastrophic emergencies.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Jon Ward, and Jon is a senior political correspondent for Yahoo News, author of a book we're going to be talking about in depth. Testimony is the subtitle, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. And Jon and I have been connected for quite some time. We've known each other. In putting together this podcast, Jon, let me just start by saying I can't remember, forgive me, I'm 71 years old. I'm almost at the age where I have a sort of a non-answerable excuse for forgetting stuff. I'm almost there, not quite. So how on earth do we know each other, and what does it go back to? Can you remind me?
Yeah. I'm going to be a little hazy on the specifics, but I know the general contours pretty well. Back when I was a very young reporter at the Washington Times, this would have been 2002 or 3. Yeah. One of your books came across my desk, probably it was in the Washington Times newsroom on a desk where there was a lot of new books. I think it was your book about your son.
Keeping Faith, a father-son story about love in the United States Marine Corps.
But it might have been Zermatt, if that's probably not how you say it.
My novel, Zermatt, that's right.
Yeah, but I remember I did something for the Times on both of those. Yeah. I think I did a review of Zermatt, and I think I may have interviewed you about Keeping Faith. But that's how we got to know each other, essentially.
Yeah, I remembered that. And the thing is, when you say something happened in the 1990s, I feel like that was yesterday. Anything in the 2000s is like 2 minutes ago. And of course, I have to stop and think, wait a minute, it's 2023. So that might have been, 15, 20 years ago. I was in reading your new book, which is wonderful, and I love it. And we're going to talk all about it. The book Testimony. As I would read your story, I was trying to place myself and our connection into it, thinking, now, did I know Jon then? Was he wrestling with all this then? And I just was trying to keep up, and I gave up finally. So let me just first say that, I read quite a bit, and Testimony is quite literally one of the best books I've ever read in terms of the subject matter. Your writing is terrific, but having been myself on so much of the same journey that you took in terms of your evolution from someone raised and propagandized and indoctrinated within the evangelical subculture, your particular wing of it being the charismatic experience, mine being more the Reformed Calvinist experience, me being a missionary kid and a pastor's son, you being a pastor's son. There's so much of your book that I felt I was almost looking in a mirror with a slight distortion because your background's different than mine, but such similarities that it was really a kind of a deja vu all over again, weirdness for me. So not only did your book have a big impact on me, and I have pages and pages of notes. I just sent Ernie 30 pages of notes that I had made from your book. It was such a pleasure reading it, and it's so good. But shorthand, if someone came to me and said, look, this question I've gotten so many times on MSNBC and other places, you're a former evangelical, can you explain to me why the evangelical community went for Trump, why they've turned into this sort of authoritarian group that is so different than what they used to be? I've tried to answer that question so many times. And now, all kidding aside, shorthand, I would say, look, there's somebody who's written the book on this. If you really want to know what happened, just read Jon Ward's book. It's many other things, but it is the best statement I've ever read that actually explains stuff that I know enough about to know that you are right, if I could put it that way. What has happened to the evangelical movement, period, how it wound up in Trump's camp, questioning the election, and all the rest of it. So, I can't say enough about how good this book is just on that. And then in addition to which, you fold in a personal narrative, very personal narrative, about your own evolution in terms of your own spiritual journey, your quest, which is and as far as that goes, that's a snapshot of that, because of course that journey is continuing. So basically, there's part of your book that is history. Here's what happened to the evangelical movement. There's a personal narrative. Here's how I journeyed through that. And then it kind of ends in a question mark, because I forget how old you are. Are you in your 40s?
Yeah, 46. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm 71. And, part of my curiosity is just personal, because I won't be around when you're 71, but you won't be where you are today, because that journey doesn't stop. I know that from experience. And then I'm going to shut up in a minute. But if we compare journeys, you sort of end where I was 20 years ago when I discovered the Greek Orthodox Church, decided that I liked liturgical worship, started going there. You had a similar experience when you discovered some of the, you might say, intellectually respectable Calvinist teachings of some people that you talk about in the book. Church history became a revelation to you. Hey, there's a whole thing here I really knew nothing about. Our journeys are very similar. And then I've kind of continued for the last 25, 30 years in the direction you seem to be going toward the end of your book. So we have really two books here to discuss. Both overlap my life. One is your incredible explanation to anyone who reads this book of what has happened to the evangelical movement, why they have become the Republican Party, why they have become the Trump cult. That's book one. Book two is Jon and your wife Allie's journey, including you becoming a better husband, coming out of your sort of, background of patriarchal indoctrination. That's also my journey. So in a weird way, we have so much to discuss here. I'm going to start the discussion about your book by reading a little bit of something in an unexpected, non-Trump related thing, but relates to your wife, Allison.
Right.
I do feel good about how I prioritize my life and kids over my career. I made decisions over the last 20 years to push away from the world of television and punditry because I thought the incentives in TV were bad for the truth-seeking, and because I knew TV promised an exchange of more money for less time with my family. That's where I want to start, because it's very personal. So let's go there. You met Allie and she changed your life. I met Jeannie and she changed mine. We both come from backgrounds in which, to put it mildly, sexuality and dealing with passion and all these other human things is difficult to understand because of our evangelical upbringing. So let me just start with you and Allison. This will be an odd place to start a book interview, but you guys seem by the end of the book to be on a good footing. Is her landscaping interest and all the rest, how old are your kids now? And what does her life consist of these days as we just go day to day?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And before I get to answering that, I just wanted to say everything you're describing about your response to my book and feeling as if you're looking in the mirror. I really felt that way when I read your books that I mentioned earlier 20 years ago. So, you were trying to figure out sort of where you were at that time in my life, but, this was mid to late 20s for me, and I was definitely searching, but pretty early in that process. And your books were very formative for me, and also evoked that same feeling of, oh, this is somebody who really understands, where I'm coming from, which is not a common experience, I think, for
Right.
people, you know, from our backgrounds. So thank you for saying that. It's gratifying, and appreciate the kind words and the encouragement. So Allie and I, you know, she was supposed to go back to work full time right before COVID hit. COVID was a real setback for her. As tough as it was for kids all over the country, and our kids in particular, to be, you know, schooled at home for a full year or more. I've even lost count of how long it was. You know, she then had to stay, you know, in the home, and we had one kid in particular who was in 6th grade at a very demanding school, and was, you know, learning. She had physics like in 6th grade, and so Allie essentially had to become a homeschool mom for that year. So that was a setback for her. She's, you know, post-COVID, she's gotten back to work. And I'm not sure if you want me to talk about our relationship or her faith. I don't want to speak too much for her.
You know, let me jump into another quote from your book, because and this is not in order. I'm sort of jumping around here. This is from later in the book. Allie and I are trying to live lives and make choices that chip away at injustice, but I still feel like I don't know what I'm doing. We struggle with how to raise our kids. There's a lot we're probably doing wrong. You know, the reason I bring this up is that one of the themes of your book, and also it happens of my writing, is this kind of echo that still is in our ears, get the ringing out of your ears from our backgrounds. I won't say it's guilt exactly, but it's a feeling of uncertainty and trepidation. With my grandchildren, for instance, when they ask me about God or faith or something comes up, my instinct is to give them a more conservative answer than my actual belief system, because it's like, well, wait a minute. I've ended up where I am because I began with this kind of conservative belief system. What if they start with what I've got? After that, you know, what's out there for them in their journey, beginning with as much uncertainty and ambivalence as I have. And so I have found myself less now, but in the childcare I do for my youngest 3 grandchildren, who are now ages 9, 10, and 15, 9, 13, and 15, I find that I hark back to like feeling I ought to be speaking more the way maybe my parents would have to them about that. And then it's like, no, I can't say that because I really don't believe that anymore. So, you know, you're saying we struggle with how to raise our kids. There's a lot we're probably doing wrong. There's a lot we're doing differently than the way we were raised. And I think that cuts to the heart of who you are, because your book about Trump is like, that's out there somewhere. That's their problem. That's not you anymore. This is like right where you and Allie live. And let's go there a little bit in terms of just our journeys.
I was just texting with somebody about church and all that, and attendance. But I think, you know, there's a lot of people who can identify with this feeling of the last several years of reassessing what they believe, and then really kind of worrying about the impact of that on their children. Because as adults, we do have the luxury, I guess you could call it, of, you know, being able to figure these things out as we go and evolve. And kids obviously have a lot of evolving to do too, but as you're kind of talking about what they are given with, what they're handed as they begin their life journey, does play a big role in how they sort of where they go from there. And so I think I share what I think I hear you saying is you don't want to, you know, send a young person out into the world with no moral compass, no sense of, you know, bearings when it comes to meaning and the quest for, you know, reality and truth and God. And so I would say, you know, I'm happy to talk more about Allie if you want, but as far as our kids go, I think I'm taking a pretty individualized approach to each of them. One's in Catholics at a Jesuit Catholic school, and I feel very good about the instruction he's getting there, both on, I was actually telling he's a sophomore and he's in a scripture class, and I was telling his teacher, like, I'm really glad that he's getting this instruction on the Bible, because I know it's going to be a lot more well-rounded than the sort of hyper-literalism that a lot of evangelicals are taught. So I feel good about that. There's younger children where in our family, we have 8, 10, 12-year-olds, where, I'm trying to be a little more assertive at sometimes about, let's go to church or let's go to this church activity. But I also am not really interested in forcing anyone to go to church. So there's that. And I, with some of our children, I'm kind of looking at them, assessing, like, am I concerned about where their moral compass is? And I'm going, no, I feel like they're evolving really well into caring, conscientious people, young humans. And so it's much more focused on, the fruit, the character, how they behave, than it is on, do they say they believe the right things? And as far as, orthodoxy, the furthest extent of that so far in terms of home instruction is I've been really building out like a liturgy that I do during Advent on, 5, 6, sometimes 7 Sundays ahead of Christmas, which I've really enjoyed and they really enjoy. We sit around the table and light some candles and, go through a liturgy that I try to make participatory. So that's some of what we're doing.
Yeah, one of the things you write in your book is, but the faith I was taught beckoned to something I still want, a fullness of life. I'm puzzled and discouraged and heartbroken that something that promised so much good has contributed to so much destruction, damage, and hurt. And that, even though that's at the end of your book, I think on page 236, it's a bridge to who you became as a reporter. And you write about that, saying, being a White House reporter was the opportunity of a lifetime. I traveled the world with Bush and Obama, flying on Air Force One more than a dozen times. I learned to stomach the pressure of questioning a president, which I did on national television on a few occasions. I interviewed President Dick Cheney. I traveled to the United Nations multiple times. I saw Africa and Asia with Bush and Europe with Obama, et cetera, et cetera. In a usual introduction that wasn't so personal because I connect so deeply with you, I would have brought all that up as, look, this is an important guy. He's traveled on Air Force One, the whole bit. But just in passing to people who are listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer and Jon Ward, my guest today, you note that Jon is a really serious journalist. And one of the great things about this book, Jon, that I really love, diving into the meat of the non-personal part, is your chops as someone who still believes that a reporter can seek the truth in what some people call our post-truth culture. And your credentials as a reporter are really good, and you have done your homework. In that context, I want to tell again that this book is the one that I would recommend above all others if you want to understand today's Republican Party. This is the book that actually talks about it in a way that makes sense from someone who's lived the experience of journeying through that, both the spiritual part of growing up evangelical and also how the politics is impacted. So you write, and there was a sizable number of Christians who, while lamenting the decline of America into a growing godlessness, would also interpret decline and even catastrophe as good, because those things hasten the return of Christ, the rapture that would usher us out of this world and into the next. This was a confused and dark nihilism mixed with a Darwinian survival of the fittest individualism. I just want to hold that paragraph out for those listeners who don't come from evangelical or more religious backgrounds to point out something Jon says in the book, which is that a great deal of the media, the general mainstream media, still does not understand the movement from which he and I came, to the point where they would read that paragraph almost in disbelief, saying, what are you talking about? Not understanding that when you look at the millions of evangelicals that voted for Trump and still support him, without kind of understanding this paragraph, you can't get a handle on what motivates them. And you can say, oh, well, it's sort of a weird conspiracy theory. Yeah, but they believe it's true. So let's take that paragraph as a point of departure to explain that that this digression into a political party, you know, having taken over the Republican Party, the evangelical movement, you know, has a theological base that a lot of the media have still either been too lazy or too out of the loop to understand, and you do. So just go there for a minute. I mean, why is it that the media, when you read the media, you know, understands the Rust Belt and understands this and that, but they never get to the nub, or rarely get to the nub, or haven't until recently gotten to the nub of what actually drives the ideology that has put millions of evangelicals and conservative Roman Catholics into this kind of whacked out conspiracy theory believing and embracing group that now still believes that Trump would make a good leader. I don't even know where to start on that, but just take it wherever you want, and I'm going to be quiet.
Sure. And before I do that, I wanted to say one more thing about Allie, because I really appreciate that you started out with her. I feel like that was the part of the book that I wished I had been able to do more of. And maybe that will, you know, but there's also the element of wanting to respect someone else's, you know, privacy and space and all that.
Yeah.
But, and you've written movingly about your wife. What was her name?
Jeannie.
Jeannie. Yeah.
Or Regina, if we're going to go former. Allie, Allison, Regina, Jeannie, but it's Jeannie.
So one of the things that I appreciate about Allie, I was thinking about this recently, is that what made me think about this was I was reading a book, and I think I've read a number of things recently where it talks about how human nature, for most people and most cultures, is to be very tribal, to stick with people who are similar to you, to draw clear lines around people who are not in your group and people who are in your group, and then to exclude and even demonize people who are not in the group. And one of Allie's core characteristics, which goes back to, you know, I've heard her tell stories, I've heard her dad tell stories about her as a young girl even, is that she always had a very almost inborn genetic disposition to be angry if someone was being treated as an outcast and ridiculed or mistreated in any way. And that is not something that I had as a young person. You know, I was an athlete. I was oriented towards hyper meritocracy in the sense that, you know, if you are talented and you can rise to the top, then, you know, you should enjoy that. And life is tough and competitive. And if you can't make it, tough luck. That was sort of my orientation as a young man, at least in high school or so. And so she's really changed me in a lot of ways, but that would be one significant way. And I'm so glad for our kids that they have that input. So when it comes to your question about evangelicalism, I believe the paragraph you read was getting at the influence of The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, which is this book that was written in the 70s that talked about the book of Revelation in the Bible in a literal sense, as sort of a roadmap for how the world's going to end. And I think that you know, impacted a lot of evangelicalism in a big way, and created the nihilism that you talk about. Because if the story of history is that we're just, as speaking as an evangelical, that we are just waiting for the return of Christ, and then we'll get sort of ejected out of the world and into heaven, and the rest of the non-believers will have to suffer through a tribulation, then yeah, that does create a sense in which the worse stuff gets, the closer we are to that deliverance. And I don't think it's on the front of people's minds all the time. I think it's just sort of seeped into the culture in a lot of different ways. And then why does the media not understand that? I think that's kind of simple. Probably it's really just that we often don't see what's coming if we're not talking to people who are reading or experiencing or believing different things. And so just like evangelicals live in a bubble, a lot of reporters live in a bubble. That's also human nature. And so if you're not in conversation with lots of different people, like a border stalker is, the archetype I talk about in the book, then it's hard to really not just see things on the radar, but understand how important they are to certain groups, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you say in the book that I think really nails it is that, and again, that it doesn't seem to be widely understood by people who don't share our background, and they haven't done their homework and they haven't done their due diligence, is this paragraph I'll read now. This use of biblical stories as allegory for current events was a way to place certain political figures on a pedestal where they could not be questioned or criticized. It was part of a trend foreshadowing the way that other politicians would be deified using Old Testament stories several years later. And you're referring to Trump, but of course, that paragraph also applies to the kind of corruption you found in pastors and denominations for sexually molesting people or their treatment of women or whatever it might be, where the women and children, as you described them, were seen as collateral damage. And the main point was to get back to respectability and all the rest of this. Again, biblical stories as allegories, whether it's David or, whoever it might be. I think that has not been well understood by people trying to cover these political events. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the thing that comes to mind is just that whether we're talking about Trump and evangelicals or pastors and bad behavior, whether it be abuse or infidelity or whatever, the thing that comes to mind is that there's actually never one input, never one cause of it. When it comes to how churches excuse bad behavior by leaders, there is at times, there are at times references to King David. Oh, he was a passionate man. He repented, this, that, and the other. But, there's also, when you talk about wanting to restore, let's say we're talking about sexual abuse inside a family. There's also this patriarchal chauvinistic mentality that views that actually starts from a place of hanging on to something that's true, which is that it's good to have a father in the home, but then takes that important thing and elevates it to the almost the only important thing,
right? And
says, like, if a father's not in a home, then like that's the worst thing that could possibly happen, rather than equally also weighing the fact that there's severe abuse here that needs to be dealt with justice. I mean, it's just sort of priorities out of whack. It's an inability to think about multiple factors. And it's, in our church environment, it was just sort of a deification of the man, which came out of this belief that men were supposed to lead in all things, essentially, and women were supposed to follow and support.
Which is still exactly where most evangelicals are today. They have not in any way changed from that position. And if anything, it's been regressive in the Trump years and going further right on so many issues. I just want to reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. If you like this podcast, please like it in the online sense of sharing it and telling people about it. And today I'm talking to Jon Ward, someone I've known for a long time. It looks like 20 years from what we were saying. That went by quick. His new book is Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. And I said at the beginning of this podcast, and I'll say it again, that anybody out there in the media, outside of the media, anyone who wants to understand what happened to the Republican Party how evangelicals and conservative Roman Catholics infected and then affected it and then took it over, as it were, and made that the driving agenda. Why there are 20 radicals in the House right now, this afternoon, getting ready to shut down the government. None of that is understandable unless you read this book. So I wouldn't say that about any book. I wouldn't say that about anything I've written, but Jon's book is the one. And then it tells this incredible story of a personal spiritual journey that has gone from his evangelical charismatic background to where Jon is today. I want to get to my childhood, this is from your book, was dominated by talk of demons and angels, speaking in tongues, the return of Jesus and the end of the world. I was the son of a pastor and the oldest of 7 kids. My father led protests outside abortion clinics. You know, the theme of abortion runs all through the book. People who follow my work and have read it know that my family was instrumental in turning the, quote, pro-life cause into the evangelical cause, which became the litmus test, which then became the driving force that got Trump elected because he said he would appoint these judges, et cetera, and the rest is history. So just talk about that a little bit in terms of your childhood. Unpack. My childhood was dominated by talk of demons and angels, speaking in tongues, and the return of Jesus and the end of the world. Because a friend of mine just went to a conference in Washington, D.C. last week of conservative evangelicals and others who were meeting with Trump and DeSantis and the others. And once again, it was all about, well, the Democrats are demon-possessed. These are spiritual battles. And again, in a language that your normal reporter would not understand. You do, because you come from that background. If you want to unpack some of that, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of follow on the point I was making earlier about how there's not one cause, the overarching point here is just that it's complex. We want to, especially, you know, you talked about television earlier, especially in the world of television, we want, and there's a need of the medium for things to be able to be boiled down to clear, simple answers. And I tried as much as possible in this book to identify clear causes and effects. But you can't really diagnose a lot of this stuff in just, I mean, if you spend a month or 6 months really trying to like nail down a 30 or 60-second pitch, you could do it. It would probably cost a lot of money from some expensive consultants, but it's complex. And I think, you know, even the act of boiling things down, again, robs us of the richness of understanding needed to really understand these things. So, you know, that's unfortunate in some ways, because it means that the problems that we're facing with our politics and the structural reforms needed and our epistemic world, you know, the world of information and misinformation, and the world of religion and politics and Christian nationalism, all these things are complex. They didn't happen overnight. They're not going to be fixed overnight. So, you know, when you ask about my childhood, you mentioned abortion. It hadn't occurred to me before that I should ask you what you think about something, but which is, you know, the Randall Balmer, Anthea Butler point about race and the IRS and segregated schools being the cause of evangelical support for the GOP rather than abortion. And I kind of get to that in the book, and I say, you know, for us it was abortion. For others, it was probably race. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, you know, I've interviewed Randall Balmer and talked to him here on my podcast, and we've known each other for quite some time. And he and I have met for lunch from time to time, so I'm very familiar with his thinking. I differ a little bit with him on that, in that I think that you could conclude by reading some of what he's saying as if it was more by design than by happenstance. I think a lot of times these things were not by design; they just happened. So there are a lot of individual threads. It wasn't so conspiratorial as crimes of opportunity. You know, Jerry Falwell suddenly understood he could raise a lot of money doing this. Pat Robertson needed a way to keep people angry and sending him $25 checks out of their Social Security. I think it was a crime of opportunity. And if it hadn't worked, it would have faded away. You know, I was not just a fly on the wall. I was in 3 meetings with the Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist, and my father happened at the Mayo Clinic when Dad was undergoing cancer treatments there and living in Rochester, Minnesota at the time. And Billy would come. Billy was a little bit of a hypochondriac, and he would come to the Mayo Clinic several times a year to undergo checkups and that kind of a thing. And so they would meet there. And I remember my dad begging Billy Graham to take a, quote, stand on abortion. And Billy described himself not in this language, but it amounted to the fact that he was pro-choice. And so was Dr. Criswell of the Southern Baptist Convention. He was then the head of the convention when it was the conservative bastion of American fundamentalism. So I think a lot of people who weren't there, as I was, assumed that somehow the anti-abortion position, the, quote, pro-life position, was de rigueur from the beginning, as, say, it would have been in the Roman Catholic Church when it came to contraceptives and abortion, but it wasn't. You know, my mom would always say how, you know, we use contraceptives. We're not Roman Catholics. And it almost was the same with abortion. It was something unpleasant. One did not talk about it. You urged people to have their children, but there was no idea that this was part and parcel along with our foundational theology as it would be today. So I was, you know, speaking of media reporting on this, I was around at a time when the first people my dad and I and Dr. C. Everett Koop with our film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and the book counterpart, you know, at the beginning, the reason we were playing to empty auditoriums where we had filled the same auditoriums 4 years before with the series, How Should We Then Live on Art and Culture and Philosophy, was because abortion wasn't, quote, our issue. So we were there at a time when it wasn't. So when it comes to the machinations of a race and the rest of it, it is true that Jerry Falwell kind of ran out of rope to hang himself with when it came to being a segregationist, and he switched into another thing. Paul Weyrich, of course, was a big thing that Randall Balmer talks about, and these other far-right Roman Catholics who were very glad to try to stir up the energy of the evangelicals, you know, kind of like the cavalry coming over the hill to save you when your movement is dying. But I think it was more organic than applaud. And I think what really happened was it caught fire for a lot of reasons unrelated to the morality of the issue. And one was fundraising, another was evangelicals suddenly becoming a good voting bloc for Ronald Reagan. People like Jack Kemp, who I knew well. I used to stay in his home, the congressman and vice presidential candidate. You know, he was in no sense pro-life, but it was like, okay, if you guys can make this into an issue, we can use it. So I don't know if that answers any of your question, but that's part of my own experience.
I just find myself thinking about the fact that, you know, I keep stressing how things are complex. And what's striking to me is that is not the kind of rhetoric or thinking that produces mobilization.
Right.
And I do think this is a problem for people that lean left, whether it's Democrats or not. There's a tendency to look for the complexity and the nuance that is missing oftentimes on large swaths of the right. I'm trying not to paint with too broad a brush. But abortion is a clear mobilizing issue because it gives people, and this is going back to your question about my upbringing, we were not political in any sense. We thought politics was rather, you know, distasteful.
You were the kind of people we were trying to talk into getting involved with politics.
Right. That's right. Yeah, it was worldly. It was ugly. It was, you know, not the kind of thing we wanted to be associated with.
Yeah.
And so we didn't really engage politically. We didn't think about political issues. We didn't educate ourselves about, you know, the world of government and politics and geopolitics. And so all of our political worldview, because, you know, most of life is political, right? So in one way or another. So our political worldview was really shaped by abortion because that was the one thing we cared about when it came to public policy. It was very black and white. It was evil versus good. It was right versus wrong. And it was Republicans versus Democrats. And if, you know, anybody supported abortion, they were evil. And so it made voting quite simple for, you know, a lot of people in churches like ours.
Well, and you talk about in the book how the issue of Trump, which then is the issue of abortion, to go back in your book and also in my writing, divided your family. And one of the poignant parts of your book is, I'll just read something from your book. January 6th made it clear that some in this country were turning away from democracy. If they didn't think they could be the dominant majority group in a pluralistic nation, many of many religions and racial identities, then they had to decide that maybe freedom wasn't so great after all and could be discarded for security. And then this is where it gets personal. I texted my father, this is your writing, not me. I texted my father the morning of January 7. I was raw from the trauma of watching the Capitol being attacked by a violent mob of people yelling about freedom and taking back America for God. Am I still hysterical? Am I still throwing a liberal hissy fit? I wrote, I warned you, and I warned you, and I warned you for years. It was clear this is where this was heading. You let your political identity blind you to love for country of your own and of your own son. And you have that in capitals. This was never about party or ideology. It was about the good of our country. This is the culmination of 5 shameful years. What a disgrace, an utter disgrace. And then, of course, he doesn't back down at that point. In addition to which, you have a little passage which I can really identify with, given all the hate mail I've gotten over the years, where you're standing in a shower, imagining yourself in a prison, having been imprisoned for being a journalist by people who talk about you as fake news, quote unquote. Now you're in prison in some right-wing junta that's taken over our country. You're in prison taking a shower, and you have this kind of flash forward, a bit of a scary thought, and your own family is divided against you, and you're getting some very ugly things back from them in terms of you being a traitor because you have seen problems with the Trump presidency. So just talk about, not only did abortion become the thing, then Trump became the thing, and then now Trump divides your family and you pay for it. And it's an incredible story. In other words, I just want to tell people about Jon's book, that it isn't some theoretical treatise on what happened to America. It's happening to Jon too. And it sounds like the two things wouldn't be compatible, but it makes for a great read, and it's just terrific.
And I think it also explains, I think, a lot of the exhaustion you are seeing among a lot of people. There's a lot of news avoidance. There's a lot of resignation about the next election. I think most people would prefer to have something other than a rematch of 2020. Yet that's what looks like is going to happen. I think there's still a chance that either party could nominate somebody else, but as of today, that's not happening. One thing that actually struck me just now was, the fear of persecution or even imprisonment. I just want to be careful to apply the same thinking to myself as I do to evangelicals. There's no question that there's a lot of persecution complex among evangelicals. They've been talking for decades about the end of Christianity, the destruction of Christianity, religious persecution. So, it's not as if they're the only ones who worry about that. I just want to always, try to, when certain things flag in my mind as, there could be some contradictions there, or you're leveling criticisms against others that you're not against yourself. I always want to be careful about doing that. And I also was thinking about how, abortion was a clear black and white thing. I've heard many conservatives complain that on social policy or spending policy, it's so much harder for conservatives to get across their message of, trickle down economics than it is for Democrats to say, just, raise taxes to help the poor. That's, so it's, the whole point I'm making is we often see the strengths of the other side, and don't really sort of apply the same criticism to ourselves. And I just want to, encourage people to continue to pursue the complexity, even if it's not always a winning strategy. There is a time for strategy and winning, but as a journalist, that's not really my job. It's not my job to help people learn how to win. It's to help people learn how to think and try to understand the world accurately.
Well, and both sides sort of imagine the other is winning, and they both fantasize about what will happen if we lose. You know, you have a very good quote. I forget what page it's on. I'm just looking, 155, where you say about Trump, he understood the deep distrust of mainstream media and culture and evangelical culture, their fear of racial change and of liberal control of government, speaking about this paranoia.
Yeah.
And then continuing what you wrote, he seemed to believe he could capture their fearful hearts, and he was likely coming to understand ways in which he could use the hypocrisy and corruption of some evangelical leaders to help himself. I mean, that's on page 155, but seriously, you know, that just should be pinned to the wall, because that's it. You've just explained a lot. And I've written, I forget where, in various commentaries or spoken on TV, I don't know where I've said this, but that, you know, one of the reasons that the evangelicals took to Trump is that in him, they found a person who is very much like their own pastor in many cases. And that is a little bit of a shaman, a bit of a huckster, a little bit of a hypocrite, you know, fooling around a little bit on the side in terms of marital issues and so forth and so on. And they had learned to understand that this was sort of how things are, but, you know, nevertheless, our pastor's a good leader. And as soon as you, of course, make it a theological issue that your man has been appointed by God, then everything else is collateral damage, as you say. But, you know, Trump blew up the media, ditched the media, and millions of Americans loved it. And this is you writing again, and I get it. How could I not? I had grown up deep inside the world that said the media was out to get us. So that's the point you've been making, but it's written, you know, very well here. If you just want to expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think in terms of media and the right and information and the right, we're definitely not, you know, at the end of this story.
No.
I think I was looking at your Twitter and you were talking about this as well. There's no end in sight was the language you used.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. I think when you look at where people are getting their information, which is why I'm starting to do a Monday, you know, thing on Substack where I interview people about where they're getting their information. Because this is, you know, I don't think it's ever been more fractured, more kind of Wild West. And I've been looking at this, thinking about this for a good amount of time. I mean, I interviewed Robert Gibbs in 2008 in the White House. You know, whoa, Robert, what about how are you going to message to a fractured media? That was, you know, more than 15 years ago. And now it's not just, you know, people getting information from all kinds of companies or news organizations on the web. It's a lot of it's through social media influencers, YouTubers, podcasters, individual brands often, as well as, you know, places like the Daily Wire. So there's a huge constellation of places on the right that are that have really kind of created an alternative news source, and I don't want to say it's exclusively or always an alternative reality, because I think that's unfair. I don't think it's always, you know, that there's lies or untruths, but it often is, you know, especially if Trump is the one sort of driving these clear lies, they can survive and even thrive in parts of the echo chamber. I was talking to somebody recently who mentioned that in the 70s or 80s, there was like 2,200 Christian bookstores across the country, and Focus on the Family had a huge number, tens of millions of listeners. You know, Ralph Reed had his information network of, you know, pastors or leaders. I just think it took a while for the right to adapt that same approach to creating an alternative way of dispersing information to the internet. And at this point, it's pretty well established, mixed in with all kinds of other crazy stuff.
Well, the evangelicals movement that I was part of in the late 60s through the 70s and 80s basically invented the idea of an alternative media. As you say, it was done through Christian bookstores, our own newspapers, our own magazines, then our own radio shows, and then finally our own TV shows, these huge television shows like the 700 Club that had millions of viewers. And then Rush Limbaugh came along and sort of made it bigger with his radio show. And then, of course, when the when the whole internet saga broke, that it became even more fragmented. You make a good point in your book about the price we have paid for losing what you might call the traditional media gatekeepers, and for all their deficits, they did have a basic tendency to try journalistically to parse through all the competing claims and say, look, here's the one where we've run the numbers, and this, it sounds like an old-fashioned word, but this happens to be a true claim, or this happens to be false. They spoke in those terms. You write in your book, 20 years ago, I thought that the biggest threats to truth were postmodern relativism and godless liberals. Today, to my shock, my own tribe of Christians has taken a battering ram to truth. And I just think that's such a precise statement of what's happened. I grew up in a home with a theological upbringing by a father who's staked his whole life on what he called an apologetic approach, apologetics, trying to make truth claims about Christianity. His whole argument was, this is all true. Christ died and rose from the dead. These things are true. And he didn't mean true only in a, quote, spiritual sense. He meant, no, this really happened. And he argued for it. What would have shocked him is anyone who argued from the left, right, or any other point of view that truth no longer matters, that it's about feelings, it's about sincerity. My father would have felt that sincerity is the most overrated virtue. It didn't matter if you were sincere. The point was, were you right? And that's all gone away. And you point that out in your book. And so, in reading your book, it's also the story of a decline of public discourse to the point where the defenders of truth as a thing, whether they had the truth or not, even that has tended to go away. And now it's simply all about raw political power. Who can steer the ship of state? Who can change public opinion? And that then breaks down into all these thousands of little websites and all the rest of it. So I'm going to ask you a question here unrelated to the book, but how do you see that aspect of the story you're telling ending? I mean, how far out do you go into this sort of biosphere experiment of truth as a thing going away? I mean, just to get radical and still have a science that provides vaccines that work, and still have colleges that educate it more than just, providing opinions on literature or, other subjective things. What happens to a society that no longer believes there's a there, that everything becomes amorphous? I mean, as a human being and as a father, forget as a journalist, how do you just see that? I mean, how does this story end? Because it seems to me like you go out into that twilight far enough away from empirical evidence and proof. That's almost the biggest threat we face, bigger than any fascist party, bigger than Trump, bigger than anything.
Yeah, I think the two biggest challenges of our time are the epistemic chaos, which is what you're talking about, and the totally screwed up incentives of our political structure. Both of these things are sort of systemic, right? And if we can't create better incentives for our politicians and our people in leadership, and if we can't figure out some rules that govern public conversation, not ultimate belief. We don't have to have rules for what you can believe about ultimate reality or faith or spirituality. That's one of the beauties of our country, is that you can believe whatever you want there. But if we don't have rules for what we can discuss as legitimate and not legitimate in public conversations about the common good in politics and government, if we don't fix those two things, then we're going to have gradual decline and potentially, catastrophic emergencies. Whether, it could come from a lot of different places. So those are the two things we need to fix. I was thinking, and there's people who are working on those things. It's not enough people. But I was thinking about, there's a journalist, her name is Zeynep Tufekci. She's written a bunch of really great stuff. She's focused a lot on, I think, long COVID right now, but she wrote a piece, I think recently, about bird flu and how it would be more deadly than COVID. I think, I don't want to throw stats out there since I'm not an expert on this, and I read it quickly, but it just got me thinking, like, if we had another global epidemic of a a bird flu with a higher fatality rate. I do think that people would sign up for the vaccine for that. If relatives and friends and children were dying at a high rate, that's the kind of thing that would cause people to not just go get the vaccine, but like beat down the doors of their local CVS for that vaccine. That's a different situation. How would they? The more interesting question is, how would they explain the fact that they were getting this vaccine but not the last one? And the answer to that is just that people rarely sort of change their mind about whether they were wrong or not. And there's an endless creativity to come up with sort of narratives that explain it all. So I think it's kind of wasted time trying to figure that out. But yeah, I'm concerned about our epistemic chaos. I think Jonathan Rausch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, is a bit dense. I've recommended it to my dad. He's reading it, but he finds it dense. And I agree, it's dense, but it's really important, a book about how we can agree on rules of the road for public conversation and public debate. And in terms of election reform, there's a group called Unite America that's doing good work on this, but there's a lot of groups doing that kind of work as well.
Yeah, Ernie, my producer, my redoubtable, wonderful producer, sent me a note that we've just sort of covered. What do we do about abandoning objective truth? And you've sort of covered it, but just go a little deeper into his question. What do we do? Not what do you think about it, Jon Ward? What do we do? We Americans, we, who remain, what do we do?
A friend of mine recently said, his grandfather was either a first or second generation Italian immigrant. And, the extent of his meaning in life was running his business and caring for his family. And that's sort of how he prefers to live his life, my friend. And I told him, the problem with that is that in those days, a couple generations ago, our politics, we essentially handed it off to elites and to party officials and a few politicians. And they were at times quite corrupt, but they generally, dealt with problems and had expertise. In our day, our politics, over the last 50 years, all of the power, not just in politics, but in all of life, really, power has really become more bottom up and more diffuse. And when it comes to our politics, our politics is really driven by public sentiment more than anything else. And oftentimes because of our primary system, it's driven by very small minorities on both sides. So all of that to say, if regular people don't at least become a little more politically aware and active, then they're essentially ceding control of the future of our country to loud and angry minorities on each side. But the problem is, what do you do beyond voting? And I think, when it comes to objective truth, when it comes to politics and voting, the answer's got to be local, material, what you can touch, what you can influence. And I think in general, the general drift has to be as much as we can do it. I know, my God, I know it's hard, but as much as we can do it, less time on screens, more time in our neighborhoods, talking to our neighbors, working on local initiatives, fixing problems we see and touch in our everyday lives, and building community that way. I do think that that's a substantial and concrete way we can begin the work of fixing some of these problems, which, as I said, are not going to be fixed overnight. There's plenty of people, smart people, talking about what the problems are, what the solutions are, and we need more of that. But for the average person, there is no clear roadmap from here to there to fix the problem. We've got to just really, I think, change our habits away from TV screens for sure, and also away from computers, and just become more attached to the real physical world and our actual real world neighbors and build community from there. That's increasingly, I just find that that's the only answer I can give to these questions.
Yeah, I think it's a good one. I want to change gears a little bit. I have a couple other things to pursue with you off the book. And by the way, I've in no way exhausted the quotes that I that I prepared to sort of toss out, and with the questions here, I have more, but I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. The first, it seems to me that one of the liabilities of the left, as someone who came to the left 40 years ago, having rejected my right-wing background and basically worked through my indoctrination, but having changed sides, if you want to put it that way, I kind of see things, I think, sometimes more clearly than people who have always been within one side or the other, in the sense that I understand you can change your mind. I think one of the fallacies of the left is that often I speak to people who share my politics who will say something like this to me. They will say, well, I would never say this in public because I don't want to give credence to the other side. But have you ever thought about the fact that, for instance, traditional families actually work better for children, two-parent house? But you can't say that because now these days that's interpreted as racist because there's so many single-parent households in terms of the Black community or the Hispanic community. So I can't say that. And that goes all the way through, incarceration, drug use, what would be best for people. Often what we know on the ground, to take what you were saying, in our local community or with my grandchildren or my own children is different than what we say in public, edited in our own minds by a kind of a self-censorship on what will fly politically. And I think if the left keeps doing that, particularly when it comes to family relationships, and I'll just take one example that I think about a lot, and that is the fallout of the sexual revolution has become completely negative. Kids are having less sex today in terms of dating. People don't know how to get together their relationships. Everybody delays parenting until the point where, we're freezing eggs and we get into a whole generation of all kinds of people with problems because their parents conceived them when they were in their 40s. No one wants to go there because then, of course, it says, now we have to question something about career versus family. Let's not unpack that. I think there's a growing list of things where the idealism of the left in the 60s, 70s, and 80s has proved bankrupt. And we would do better in the liberal community to be honest about these issues and unpack them, even if, and let the chips fall where they may. I may have used bad examples here, but I just want to toss that out because you're such a keen observer of what's going on around us, and I want to see things change. And I think that's part of the problem.
It's funny you mentioned the phrase, I would never say this in public, because I literally just talked to a guy named Yasha Monk, who's a public scholar who's written a book called The Identity Trap, which came out today, actually.
Which, by the way, I'm trying to get in touch with him to interview him here. So tell Yasha we want to talk to him.
I will. And, that statement, I would never say this in public, is how he started off our conversation, that's why he wrote that book.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you say that the idealism of the 60s and 70s is bankrupt. I think part of the through line of my book is that the hope or the promise of the Jesus movement in the 70s has also become corrupted. Yes. So that's an interesting parallel there. But I agree with you very much about, a censoriousness on the left that Yasha also makes this point that a lot of it was intensified and calcified by Trump because any dissent was giving aid to the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, hey, we can't weaken our argument because in a good world we could, but the alternative is fascism. So what are we going to do?
I mean, this is why I think Elon Musk has so much appeal to people. I've done a lot of writing and thinking about the topic of free speech and how it relates to both, physical real world settings like the Stanford speaker who was shouted down by progressive students, and how free speech connects to the online world. And, Elon Musk proclaims himself as a champion of free speech online. Clearly, that's not the case. Clearly, he is, cynical on a lot of this stuff and is just using Twitter or X to privilege his point of view now. But the reason that he has so much appeal is, I think, twofold. One is that people look at his, Tesla and SpaceX, and they say, if he did that well, he could do this well. But the other part is he really does, like Trump, stand as somebody who's taking a wrecking ball to whatever you want to call it, political correctness, people saying you can't say that, you can't discuss that, that's And I'm not talking about, the election was stolen. I'm talking about things like what you talked about. And I think COVID, quite honestly, was like a perfect storm for this, because we had misinformation on one side, and on the other side, we had a lot of screw ups, whether it was the Surgeon General saying don't wear masks because they don't work, when he actually was just trying to preserve them for, emergency workers, to sort of the over eagerness of the press to shoot things down or raise things up as gospel truths in an environment where truth was really hard to know and really contingent, and our understanding was evolving. So we had a lot of overconfident. It was just a huge, perfect storm for increasing distrust in our institutions of media and government. I think I don't even remember what the original question was, but it was about this. I can't say this in public.
The idea that there are these things we can't discuss honestly because it would give credence to some of our right-wing opponents.
Yeah, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier as well about how, unfortunately, the truth is complex. It's easier to mobilize people with black and white, easy answers. And so that's another reason, another motivation to be reductionist. And, there are people in politics and government who have to do that to win elections. I get that. But when it comes to the rest of us, we have to do our due diligence, even if it's sometimes to our disadvantage, to really seek out the complexity.
I want to turn to something before we wrap up here. And that is your personal spiritual journey. You just wrote about it, so I don't feel any timidity about going there. And because I've had a very similar journey, it just seems to me that at some point in the future, you may consider an idea that I've thought about a lot, having read a book that really changed the way I saw certain things. It's rare you read a book that changes the way you see things, but I actually read one about 5 years ago that really opened some new doors for me. As you well know, growing up in an evangelical background, evolution is not something we studied very hard. But Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who's a terrific writer and brings the chops of a great writer to her subject, wrote a book quite a few years ago called The Old Way. And it was about the 2 years she spent in the Kalahari with her father and mother. Her dad founded Raytheon, and he decided to take 2 years off and just go live in the Kalahari with the oldest indigenous tribe that could be found, which was the desert people of the Kalahari. And she was 19, and her mother was an anthropologist, I think, who was writing, and she quotes her mother a lot. And what they discovered was so interesting to me in her book called The Old Way. This was a culture that, without interruption from, as best anybody could tell, had been doing what they did in the Kalahari for, and listen to this, 80,000 years. Okay, so from the dawn of human evolution, as it were, to the present, this group had been living in that region. And they were the first outsiders who had ever had contact with this particular little group of hunter-gatherers. One thing that was so remarkable to me, coming from a background that says, if you don't have God, if you don't have Jesus, if you don't have the teachings of Scripture, all hell will break loose. Everyone, there'll be no rules, was that if you read what she wrote about her observations of this group and her mother's observation, we would describe them as a family-oriented community, sharing, caring, survival of the friendliest dominated group of people. No Jesus, no God of the Old Testament, no Beatitudes, no Sermon on the Mount. And they were living in a way, not because Jesus told them to, but because they had evolved a manner of surviving in the most brutal place on earth for human survival. It was a matter of what evolution had taught them, turned out to be very much like what I grew up thinking only Jesus can give you. And it really changed the way I see things, because I've done some further reading off Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's book. She's written great books on growing old, all sorts of stuff. But anyway, it was a really new thought to me. And that was a kind of a cart and horse thing, that long before there was even written language, there were groups of people who were living, and maybe, just maybe, the reason that Jesus's words resonated so and built such a thing which actually is very new. It's just a couple thousand years old. So it's like a blink compared to their existence in the Kalahari, let alone the whole of human evolution, let alone the evolution of carbon-based life forms. But the fact of the matter is I've really changed my opinion. And that is, I'm at a very different place than you are as you wrap your book up, still looking for a Christian answer, as it were. And that is, I really believe that evolution teaches the survival of the friendliest, and that the reason we listen to any spiritual teachers at all and hold them up as great leaders, whether it's Jesus or Buddha, whomever it might be, or Martin Luther King Jr. for that matter, is when their words happen to tap into the deepest instinctual truths that evolution teaches us. You and me would not be talking today here. We wouldn't be here if someone somewhere long before Jesus came along cared and had picked up our great somebody and helped them when they had a broken leg or fed them when they were hungry. We're here because the survival of the friendliest actually worked. And so it seems to me the only reason Jesus's teaching resonates and so deeply speaks to people like you and me still is because it taps into something that's pre-Jesus and pre-religion. It's called survival. It's what we are taught. It really does take a village. So Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's book really changed the way I began to think about this. And it basically was the door out of, but don't we need these teachings? What will we do? Won't there be total chaos if we give up all our religion? The kind of things that Ross Douthat at the New York Times writes about and why he's still a Catholic and so forth and so on. And I felt at the end of your book, I just wondered if you had considered this. And it's not exactly a secular alternative to faith, but I think it is a more truth-based vision of why we long for the kind of order that Christianity does provide and why people like you and me miss it and still look for it even after we leave. And I've kind of gone to another step, and I wouldn't exactly call it atheism because I get up every morning and pray. Who to, I don't know. A very simple historical prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner, and then I pray for my family. But I do that because that's how I was raised, not because I believe it. And I need it in the same way that sometimes you need therapy, not as the answer, but as an answer for you. That said, I really think this point that Elizabeth Marshall Thomas raises obliquely, which is, look, evolution taught us how to behave. And when we kill people and behave badly, we are actually contradicting the only means of survival we have, which is community and caring. So her book really, she never said that, but I took that from the book and I thought, God damn, this is something my dad never dared bring up. And that is, Jesus didn't invent kindness. The only reason we're here is because people were already doing what Jesus talked about before there was a Jesus or even religion. We don't need the Old and New Testament to figure this out. We just need the fact that if my grandchild has an accident tonight riding her bike, one of my neighbors will run out of their house, pick her up and call me. And they're not doing that because they're a Christian. They're doing that because they're a human being. And that's the only reason we're here. Our instinct is toward that. So that's a very long-winded thing, but I had to ask that question because I got to the end of your book saying, forget the podcast, forget reading the book. I just want to talk to Jon and just say from 20 years down the road from where he's at today, this is how I see things. I'm not asking you for a quick answer. Maybe you haven't thought about this, but does any of that resonate with you?
Well, yeah, and I think I'm of two minds of how to answer. One, would just be to focus on the element of survival, the element of human community that you're describing. The other way to answer that is just to say that there's not, to me, an inherent conflict between what you just described and believing in God, or believing in Christianity. And, you say you don't believe that prayer. Another way to say that potentially would just be to say that those words, that language is the equipment you were given to try to understand and make contact with the mystery of ultimate reality and hopefully the divine. And I actually don't know if I should say hopefully. I mean, for me, I think I hope there's a God. But I haven't spent, what I will say is I haven't spent a lot of time probably thinking about whether it would be a good thing if there weren't a God. I think I've just always assumed that it would be a terrible thing if there weren't. But, the thing that evangelical or just religious, certainly conservative religious culture sort of embeds in you is a fear of asking questions like this. And I think the thing I always come back to is that I was taught to pursue the truth, and the truth is what's real. The truth is not, what one person or another says is the truth. It's what's real. And, if it's real that there's no God, then, it's the path of integrity is to pursue that, and to, we're never going to know. Like, that's why we call this whole thing faith, is because we ultimately we have to sort of jump off the ledge and say, okay, this is what I believe. This is what I know, or this is what I've found out, and this is now what I believe. But, I think the path of integrity is one to pursue truth where it leads. And I do believe that there is some rhythm or, moral logic to the universe. Whether it's, what you were describing was kind of a pragmatic logic to morality. And I do think, there's a lot to that. But there's also an element of beauty. Love is not always logical, in the sense that, love is often self-sacrifice. And to me, that's really the beauty of the Christian faith at its core. The Sermon on the Mount, other teachings, is that, there are these counterintuitive principles of loving your enemy and forgiving those who hurt you, and, serving those, serving others, even if it sometimes is to your detriment. Those do create a more harmonious world, but they're awfully hard to live out.
Talking to Jon Ward, and his book is Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed, a Generation. And I've said 1,000 times in this interview that it's the book you have to read if you want to understand this moment in history. And if you want to get to know Jon too, and his wife, Allison, it's a good read as well. But let me just follow up a little bit on what you were saying, and I hope people do really go out and buy Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's book. And one of the reasons it's not as known as it should be is she's a female writer who was writing in a male field, and always was resented by the kind of people down at Harvard that, she lived in Cambridge, and her dad founded Raytheon and so forth. And she's a member of the elite, but it's a she, and she's writing about their preserve. And so, her work has not been poo-pooed at all on an academic level. It's way ahead of any of her contemporaries, but she is a person who suffered from being a woman author. And I am a great advocate for her work, her whole body of work in that book. But I want to follow what you were saying a little further. And that is, it seems to me that, when I look at my own personal faith journey, one of the reasons that I would still pray, and one of the reasons that I kind of have this hope of some sort of existence after death, but also just that we haven't utterly wasted our entire lives on pursuing these things. I recognize I was conditioned for this to be a thing for me for the rest of my life, and I can't pretend it's not. And that is this faith journey. I grew up. You can't get away from that. I also think that it's a form of mental illness in some ways to spend your whole life discussing the kind of things. Here I am, 71, still talking about this shit with you, and you're on the same journey. What a shame. It's a beautiful day. Why can't we do something useful? But when I come back to my own view, this will sound a little bit sentimental, but having read your book and your love for Allison and what she did for you, one of the recurring themes in my own life is that I've been with Jeannie now 53 years. I got her pregnant when we were 17 and 18. I've gone from being an asshole by divine right to a fairly decent husband. I was trained to be an asshole by divine right because I was taught men should be in charge. Very much your sort of journey. Jeannie and I are at a wonderful place in our lives. And I've arrived at this point in my life realizing that my life will not be long enough to love Jeannie as much as I want to. What I miss about the idea of mortality and death, whether it's her or mine first, and at 71, that's closer than it was when I was your age, is that I've only begun to unpack the beauty of our relationship. And the very fact that I feel that way tells me something perhaps about truth. And if you can be 71 years old and so in love, more in love with this woman than you were when you were 18, more in love than when you were 20 or 40 or 50 or 60, and realizing this treasure that this person is in your life, that longing for more, love, not life. I don't give a shit about what all these tech bros are doing. I don't want to live forever, but I want to love Jeannie forever. It's a different thing. I want to love her forever. I never want there to be a time in existence from here to the end of time that I'm not loving Jeannie, because that's my most worthwhile moment. To actually feel that way sincerely is more of an indication to me that there might be something more out there that I understand or don't than anything else in my life. And it's the desire for more love. It's not more life. I don't give a shit about more life. It's a desire for more love. And the experience of love is so profound that I have with Jeannie that it seems to me that that's an unanswerable question. That desire for more love to me is an indication of moreness, that of more out there than what I can explain. And I don't know how you react to that, because I know you're on your journey with Allie and your children. You're at a different place, but that's this 71-year-old guy on your path. I want to look back at you on the trail and say, that's where I feel today.
Well, it's a gift to hear you describe that. It's really beautiful. It's inspiring. I feel lucky about where we are in our marriage right now, but man, we've been married for 18 years. And how long have you guys? Almost 50?
53.
Wow, 53. You can, when I say this, it's going to sound silly to you, but man, it's hard at times. There are stretches.
Doesn't sound silly at all. We've had the worst marriage you can imagine. If you want to go back in time in a time capsule, say, how could they wind up here? Yeah. Let's take some afternoon in 1983 or, 85 or 92. We've had terrible times, but I'm talking about right now.
Yeah.
Huge. And I don't mean we had a fight and we reconciled. I mean, just roller coaster, go get therapy or I'm leaving you times.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And, there are, Allie and I are very different people. And, there are times in marriage where you just think like, was this meant to be? Did we make a huge mistake? So I'm just mostly absorbing what you said, wanting to remember it, wanting to remember what you said, wanting to hold on to that in times in the future that are harder, because God knows they'll come. I hope we can keep building on where we are now. I'm happy to say that we're just going through a really nice time. But maybe the point for people who are listening who are going through a harder time is that I guess the point, I'm curious what you would say to this, is that unless there's abuse or as long as both people are invested and are trying to make it work. I'm not advocating for people to stay in marriages where there's abuse or anything like that, but sometimes hanging on does get you through to times that are much better. And I do think, I'm not here to make a statement about divorce for or against, but I am very grateful for our relationship, and I aspire to experience what you're describing.
Yeah, and I think it applies to every stage of development of a human community as well, but especially family. I pick up my grandchildren. It's my youngest granddaughter, who's now 9, at school every day, and I often, joke with the people picking up that, it's mostly younger people, younger mothers and so forth, a few fathers. I probably am always the oldest person on the playground waiting for my granddaughter to come out. But, I'm able to talk with them about their struggles. And young parenthood is always tough because it seems like forever. And then all of a sudden that's over. you're, quote, stuck with this baby who keeps you up, and then you're stuck at home, and who's going to do childcare? But all this goes terribly fast, really. When you look back, these were very quick things, but only in the moment did it seem long. And I think it's the same thing in the dynamic of relationships. You know, the terrible years Jeannie and I had probably were terrible months. And then, but looking back, it seems so much longer. And I think, you know, our culture, one of the illnesses of our culture is instant everything. And everybody thinks relationships should work if they're going to work.
Yeah.
You know, if we had ducked out when we were married for only 15 years, we would have missed all the good times. And that seems odd because everybody thinks younger, everything is better. But actually, it's crazy because, you know, our best moments were always later in life because we were scrambling so hard during the striving years just to stay afloat, let alone the fact that I slammed the door on my easy evangelical income. Now, what the hell are we supposed to do? So it was like, I don't know how to do anything else except be an evangelical something. So, you know, we had our own struggles, but everybody does. And I'm just glad that, you know, and the reason I love Jeannie so much for so many reasons, but one of them is she, you know, hung in there with me through this crazy journey when I was doing all this changing. I mean, you know, just amazing to have this gift of someone who's willing to go through your suffering with you and hang in there and come out the other side still loving you or seeing something she still loves. And then you wake up one morning and it's like, okay, the waters we're sailing on now are more peaceful for a few minutes. And you look around and there's a lot to be grateful for, you know, so hanging in there is part of the battle.
Yeah, I agree.
But in any case, thank you, Jon. This has been great. And I'll just finish up by saying Jon Ward is a senior political correspondent for Yahoo News. We didn't say how's that all going, but I presume it's moving along. Testimony is the book Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed, a Generation. Several things about the book just to wrap up. One, the links to all this will be wherever this podcast is, so you don't have to make notes. We're going to put it up everywhere. Secondly, please share this podcast with people because I like this discussion with Jon, and I think you need to share his book with people. Read it yourself. In all seriousness, if you want to understand this political moment, it's the best book out there on this political moment, because if you take the evangelicals out of the equation, it's not this political moment. So you can't understand it unless you understand what Jon wrote about. Sorry, that's the truth. And secondly, it's a great love story and a great personal journey of spiritual awakening, and it's a great diary along that road. So anybody who's traveled any spiritual path at all will find something tremendous to identify with. So I really love this book, and I just really hope that it continues to do terrifically well. It's a very important book. So thank you, Jon, for writing the book.
Thank you, Frank. It's great to talk with you, and hope we can talk again soon.
I'd love to. And anytime you want to share anything, just get in touch with Ernie, our producer, and just say, I have something I want to talk about. Honestly, you know, I would love to do that because I've so enjoyed this conversation, but also I think you bring so much to the table.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for all your writing over the years. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Jon, and all the best with the book. And please stay in close touch, because honestly, we've got to keep following up, sadly, because this story is only half written, and we'll have to see where we are. So, you know, you and me may share that prison shower together sometime. Who knows? If it all goes to hell. Tell me where your escape route is. We'll hold up.
Now you're really going to make me a praying man.
There we go. All right. Well, all the best to you and Allison. And your kids.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Same to you and Jay. Bye-bye.